Hello, good morning, and welcome to the fourth event in Steers Beyond the Rails series, where we are celebrating 200 years of the modern railway. I am Neil Kirkwood. I'm an Associate Director in Steers Rail Advisory Team, and very, very pleased to be talking today about a subject that's very close to my heart over 23-ish years in the rail industry, which is the performance of the rail network, how we improve it and make sure that therefore the railway does as much as it can for people, communities, and the country. I am delighted to have a guest with me today who has championed a high performing and growing railway across a distinguished career from leading London Overground and Chiltern's rail business to Arriva and MTR's UK and Ireland wide organisations to now as chair of the Network Performance Board and also chair of Irish Rail, where he is overseeing an unprecedented level of investment in the transformation and growth of the railway and what it does for the island of Ireland. So, Steve Murphy, after that introduction, welcome.
Yeah, thanks very much, Neil. Very generous introduction as well. Good to see you.
Good to see you again. Thank you very much for being here. So we'll come to what it is that the industry needs to be aiming for and focused on, but let's start with the bigger picture. Why now, at this moment, is the performance of the railway so crucial to where we go from here?
Yeah, so I think, Neil, in the right context, I think always with any railway I've been involved with, and I think this works, applies internationally actually. Safety is the primary, has to be the primary focus for any railway. Um, but something I've always found to be complementary actually to good safety delivery is good performance, good operational performance, and it has never gone away. It's always been the most important thing. It's in my experience the most important and surest way to high levels of customer satisfaction, to a high performing railway. But I think in this particular moment, what's really interesting is I would say in all my time working in the railway in the UK, there's never been a clearer direction set by government, which I think is actually a big opportunity for the railway. We're going through a lot of change and positive change towards GBR. Um, and that sets the kind of the midterm objective for the industry. But what government are saying really clearly at the moment, I think clearer than ever actually, is look, success is about improving levels of operational performance, and they've actually specified that helpfully, I think, in two very straightforward metrics. One is to raise punctuality on the time to three metric to 90%. And the other one is to get cancellations down from current levels, which are around about 4% nationally, to around about 2%, so to half them. And I think that's really good. I happen to think those are exactly the right things. I think if the industry were to write its own objectives, that's what we should write for ourselves. And that's probably not a coincidence that we have railway experts all the way up through Department for Transport, right to our Minister and our Secretary of State. And I just think as an industry, we should take advantage of what is really a really clear and sensible direction for government right now.
Thanks, Steve. And you touched on that point on there. We know from every round of transport focused research and everything else we know as railway professionals that being able to trust and rely on the railway performing is number one for passengers.
Yep.
Have you seen that change, or how we need to think about that change post pandemic when more passengers have more choice about whether and how often they travel?
I think I mean it's really interesting how patterns of travel have changed, and that's been evolving, and it feels like it's settling into finally settling into a new normal now, which is actually in terms of demand is actually I think really positive for the railway because we almost have a smoother and more consistent passenger demand throughout the week than we ever had before, pre-pandemic. So the big peaks are kind of still there Tuesday to Thursday for sure, but we now have this really resurgent off-peak market, which is great, and weekend travel. And actually, the industry needs to continue to adjust to the opportunities that gives, because I think actually there's opportunities there for efficiency and for performance. But back to what customers fundamentally need from the railway, I actually think that's as consistent now pretty much as when I started my career 34 years ago. And and it's always been the case that I think I happen to think the UK public are very, very fair, scrupulously fair, in fact, and they kind of start as I think the people who use the railway in the UK are kind of fans of the railway, really, even if they don't express it that way. I think our customers are very fair to us, and I would sort of characterise it as if all the railways I've run, if 90% of the time, the train as a customer I turn up to get does what I promised to do in the timetable, then actually in the UK, I think people are very forgiving, and they'll sort of say, well, if you get it wrong one time out of 10, fair enough. Generally speaking, this works. It's
Yeah.
kind of a classic sort of UK characteristic of fairness, I think, and consideration. But if you are down at the kind of the 80% or the 70%, then you just push people's patience a bit too much, I think, and you erode customer confidence. So that's why I happen to think the targets government have set are really, really good, because I think if we can get the industry back to around 90% T3, and the industry has
Yeah.
been there before, so it is possible. I think what we'll find is we get really strong and building levels of customer satisfaction, because I think the UK public and rail travellers are actually very, very fair. They recognise when
Yeah.
when you're trying hard. They also recognise when you're not working hard enough, frankly. So I think we've got to demonstrate that.
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you, Steve. And yeah, with those kind of clear aims and targets in mind of 90% T3 punctuality and down to 2% cancellations, if that's kind of what we need to be aiming for, in your role on Network Performance Board and across the industry, what priorities do you think we need to be focused on?
So we've just gone through, in my role as chair of MPB, and I was honoured actually. The industry asked me to do that because I was independent, having left MTR around a year ago. My approach to this was to have a conversation with the industry, and over the last year, what we've done is we've spent a lot of time actually talking to every part of the network right across the UK, not just England, but also in Wales and Scotland. It's been two things really. It's been asking the industry, what do you think we should do to respond to this very sensible request from government to raise our game on performance? So the first thing was getting opinion. The second was to ask everyone to showcase their solutions and best practice. And of course, what you find when you do that is parts of the industry are absolutely excelling against the government targets. So we have operators today that are running services well above 90% and with cancellations well below 2%. So we have the answers in pockets of the industry. It's important to say, I mean, I should have said earlier, the 90 and 2 objective is an average national objective, and there is an absolute recognition that the levels of performance that are appropriate for different type of operators need to be nuanced a little bit. So this isn't about everyone's got to get to 90% and reduce cancellations to 2, but as an average, we do that. It is more complex on the long distance operators to drive down T3 or drive T3 up to those sort of levels. So there is that level of nuance in it, but nonetheless, on average. So over the last year, we've gone through that process and we found best practice. As I suspected, really, the industry does have the answers to what will enable this. But we've really focused on 5 pillars under our performance restoration framework, which are the first of them and the biggest single win on performance is to look at our actual train plans. And it's often an area of the railways that doesn't quite get the focus it should. And in the railways, we get to write our own exam paper. So given we write the exam paper, it should be one we pass with flying colours every day, in my view. And what we have at the moment in the UK, for all sorts of reasons, are quite a lot of train plans that every day are not deliverable to a reliable level or a suitable level of reliability. And everyone kind of in the industry knows that. I think we know how to deal with that. We have some very sophisticated models today to give us potential solutions and allow us to iterate timetables. So the first one and the biggest one is just re-looking at all of those base plans. And there's some great work going on with Network Rail, supported by the supply chain industry, to bring the very best modelling capability to understand that, and then to make the changes. And so this is forgetting all the things that can affect the railway. It's just saying the base plan itself, does that base plan work? and we have lots of examples where actually it doesn't work as well as it should. So that's number one. Closely behind that is the actual operation delivery of the plan. So if we say, right, we're going to look to fix the plan in terms of making it more resilient by design, the second bit is, are we taking all the opportunities to run today's train plan as well as we could? And the railway has not been created anywhere in the world that you cannot look at and say, if we just did this or that differently, we would get better performance results. I'm absolutely passionate about that. So this is in the absolute detail of operational delivery. So it's how we dispatch services, it's how we manage dwell times. It's looking at our policies for staff. It's looking at professional driving policies. It's an almost limitless list of things. And saying, look, could we improve each of those? And they're incremental gains, and in some cases, they're gains of seconds that build up to minutes improvement. So that's the collection of operational things. That's pretty big. The second area is resourcing, and it's kind of challenging a long-held industry view that goes back a very long way. That actually you have a resourcing plan for the number of people you need to run the railway, whether that's train drivers, signallers, permanent way staff, response staff. But actually you never quite recruit to that level. And this has been a long held tradition in the railway. You run with big vacancy gaps. It's a thing we do. And actually in today's modern railway with better wages and conditions for staff, actually the need to have lots and lots of overtime to run the railway, kind of the reasons that developed traditionally are no longer there. It's inherently less reliable. It's more unpredictable. And actually, it's probably not the best plan for the workforce of the railway. So it's saying, right, let's modernize all of that and let's properly resource ourselves so we've got the people to run the railway that we need. So that's resourcing. After that, we get into something very sorry.
Sorry. Interesting stuff, and we will definitely come on to the following pillars as well. I just wanted to come in on that point because those first two pillars, as you say, really do come together. Is there anything we need to do differently in practice, whether that's now or anticipating GBR in future, to make sure those two things are worked through together? So the development of a robust operating plan that can be delivered reliably, along with the understanding of the resourcing across the network that it takes to deliver that plan day in, day out. What needs to change there?
So there's some really good. So we're now having spent the last year or so consulting with industry and developing this plan. We're now on with implementation. So specifically on the train plan, there are 3 strategic reviews of train plans in operation at the moment. Vanti West Coast, Transpennine and Northern, where we're going back to the fundamentals and saying how could we redesign these train plans so they are inherently more reliable. So that work's already underway. On resourcing, there's been some excellent work done by the industry and supported very, very effectively by RDG, starting with train drivers actually, because there's been a very significant shortfall of train drivers in the industry. And now a 7-point code has been developed, adopted by industry, and now contractualized. That is the roadmap to how we address that in a consistent and robust way. So that work is already underway, and each train company now on train drivers, for example, are putting those plans together to ensure we get resilient establishments of train drivers going into the future. And that's a model we then want to take to the other railway grades as well, signallers and response staff and so on.
Great. And you talked about resourcing there, also applying to the levels of resource within Network Rail as it is currently.
Absolutely.
Across and maintenance. And there's a link there to the third pillar, which is about maintaining the railway reliably across track and train.
Correct.
But in terms of the reliability of the assets and them kind of failing less and lasting longer, we know that funding is constrained, kind of twas ever thus, but in the current control period, CP7, funding for maintenance and renewals is kind of recognized as below the levels that would be required to sustain the asset condition at a sustainable level. So is it a losing battle in that sense, or is it about more than just the maintenance budget?
Hmm. Yes, I think is the short answer, Neil. But I think important to say, and I probably should have said at the start, the 5 things that MPB is setting out to do
Mm,
are sort of fundamental and permanent ways of improving performance. But it's important to
yeah,
say they are absolutely not the totality of all the performance opportunities there. And one of the bits of feedback I had from the industry when I started this was, don't try, whatever you do, don't try and do everything, because if you try and do everything, you'll achieve nothing. So we've been quite
mm,
selective. So we're not looking to, and of course, the industry, there's lots of other forums that look at asset
mm,
reliability, and it's a day job for so many colleagues in the industry. We're not
mm,
particularly looking at that subject, but what we are looking at is our ability to respond to infrastructure failures of all sorts. And that's where we're looking particularly at metrics, looking at time to get relevant staff to site and time to fix.
right,
So it's a very specific element. And the reason we've chosen that is the industry has consistently been saying, and some of the early data is showing, that issue has been going in the wrong direction for some time.
yeah,
Separately, there are lots of excellent people and professionals looking at improving asset performance. And actually,
mm,
there are parts of the railway network where asset performance is improving despite all the funding challenges. So again, there's best practice as there always is. But
yeah,
our specific thing is looking at that response capability.
yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned data and the better use of it there, Steve.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
yeah, time to site and time to fix are areas where it has been difficult in the past to have good quality data
mm,
to go on, and
mm,
it's probably symptomatic of where we are as an industry. Sometimes kind of awash with data and information, but not
yeah,
always in a way we can use. Are there any other
yes.
kind of key areas where you see the role of data and the capabilities that we have now as important to improving performance?
Yeah, it's almost limitless. We could spend the whole call talking about the opportunities for data in the industry. I think, I suppose my headline would be, from practical experience as well, I think the industry is absolutely awash with data, and at the same time are starved of management information. So
Right.
I guess if I take one example that has been building and building and building for the last 20 or 30 years, when train manufacturers started to get more modern, more sophisticated, more based on software capability, the mechanical engineering,
Mm,
modern trains now have so much data that they're throwing off that are telling us condition the infrastructure. Modern trains tell you pretty much everything that drivers do on the train, and yet our ability to access that data is really, really limited. So you could kind of, and the remote condition monitoring opportunities to make more of that data. So yeah, I think there's just so much to go at in that area, and to some extent it's not looking to find more data sources. It's turning what we currently have, which I think is really significant, into management information. That's the challenge.
yeah. Okay. Great. Um, Bring us on to the next of the pillars of the performance restoration framework,
Yeah,
Stephen. Just a quick mention for the audience, as this can be a sensitive and difficult subject. So I just want to let people know we are going to move
yeah,
on to talking about responding to and managing and dealing with, and hopefully preventing trespass and fatalities on the
yeah,
railway. So,
yeah,
uh,
yeah,
as I alluded to there, the railway is part of a wider social picture and a challenge in this sense, and it's been an issue that we've been struggling with for a long time uh,
mm,
to get ahead of. Um, do we know, and do you have a feel for kind of how we can have an impact on the railway, on something that is largely driven by external factors and yeah, social drivers?
yeah, absolutely. So, and this again, everything we do is drawing on excellent work that the railway's been doing for many years,
Yeah.
understanding some of these trends. But the
Mm,
final 2 areas we picked to make up the 5 pillars. So I've talked about the
yeah.
train plan and tactical ops.
Yeah.
I've talked about resourcing, and I've talked about response. The final
Yeah.
two, we selected 2 elements to railway performance that have been showing long-term deteriorating trends, and quite significant deteriorating trends.
Mm,
Um, and one of those is trespass. The other is the amount of time we will stop trains in operation in order to manage any sort of incident. And what we've
Right.
seen over the last 20, 30 years or so is trespass events continually increasing year on year. And what we've also seen at the same time is the number of times we stop the train service in operation has been ratcheting up year on year on year.
Mm.
And so we've looked at both of those. And I guess if I take trespass first, what we observe about trespass, and there's so much good work the industry does on this already, it's important to say. So I think the rail industry is a very good citizen in trying to protect the general public from trespass, and the industry does really, really well on that. But nonetheless, the amounts of trespass are just increasing really significantly. But there's two factors we see through the research. So one is, I think up to 40% of reported trespass events that have an impact operationally are concluded after the event not to have been actual trespass events. So what
Right.
that tells us is this is people on or around the railway that diligent people are spotting and observing and are then advising the railway, often railway staff themselves.
Mm.
We are then miscalculating their actual trespass events when actually they're not. They are people perhaps near the railway, not on the railway, or they may be people who kind of are perceived to be, through a particular sight line, getting close to the railway, but actually aren't. So what that tells me is that our initial diagnosis just needs to be more detailed so that we can look at that 40%. And there are opportunities there, because they're not trespass events, where we can keep the service running. Or
Right.
if we do need, if we're not sure, we may caution a train, but we don't stop the service. So I think that's a big opportunity. There's around 40%. For the remaining 60% that really are trespass events, then of course they're in a range of categories. But one of the things that I think we can learn from how the industry's dealt with big performance challenges in the past is there are often, for people who are deliberately trespassing, and of course it's worth saying, this is a criminal event if you're deliberately trespassing, there are no consequences quite often for that happening. And there needs to be a consequence for doing that, because apart from anything else, of course, people are putting their lives at risk, whether they're aware of that or not. So we're working very closely with the industry and with British Transport Police to say,
Right.
what are the opportunities, and the consequences is not one answer, but there needs to be some consequence of that. Individuals who trespass need to be informed that they've done that. They need to be informed the railway knows that's happened, and we need to start a conversation. So I think that's the other big opportunity with the 60% remaining trespass. And there are some really good technologies being deployed to do exactly that, working with BTP. So whether that's the use of drones, the use of geofencing technology, the use of tremor alarms, and so on, there's a range of opportunities. On keeping trains moving, and actually the project has got the title of Keeping Trains Moving Safely, being led by a gentleman called Phil Barnes in Network Rail, doing great work on this. That's really looking at, I think each period we look at around 100 events where we stop trains for an hour or more. And it's looking at each of those and saying, was it absolutely unavoidable that we had to stop the train service? And if we had opportunities to keep trains moving, even under caution, could we have taken them? That's led to a rulebook change that's coming in towards the end of this year from RSSB to say, if you follow a particular process and you do a dynamic risk assessment, there may be opportunities to keep trains moving in the event of incidents on the railway. And the reason that's, of course, so important is one of the most dangerous things you can do as a railway is when you stop trains, you have a vehicle, obviously, with hundreds of people on it, sometimes 1,000 people on it, and an uncertainty about when they're going to get to their destination. And in the worst cases, of course, that leads to one of the most dangerous acts on the railway, which is unplanned passenger evacuations where people's lives are at risk. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is that a very large part of the general public have varying levels of medical requirements that, if they're on a trap train for a period of time, start to become a risk element as well. So there's some really good reasons, not about performance, actually about safety, for trying to keep trains moving safely. The rulebook change that's coming towards the end of this year really enables that, and already that technique, keeping trains moving safely, it's been run as a training course sponsored by Network Rail, that's going out to Network Rail and train companies. And controllers right now today are using those techniques to keep trains moving, whereas in the past we would have
Yeah.
possibly stop them.
Great. And yeah, a great example of kind of where you started in this conversation, which is how complementary keeping people safe and the railway performing reliably is. You
Yeah,
touched on each of these elements along the way, but yeah, the question I had in my mind in these kind of areas is, how much of this is about kind of processes and standards, how much is about technology and system solutions, and how much of this is about people and behaviours? What's your view on the kind of the balance of all three there?
that's a really that's an even better summary than I managed, Neil, of the components you need. If I was trying to
Yeah,
weight them, I think it is all of that. It is all of that. I mean, in on keeping trains moving safely, a lot of it is cultural. A lot of it is we've had 20, 30 years for completely understandable reasons of saying if there is any risk at all, let's stop the train service in order to establish what's actually going on, let's say, with the infrastructure.
mm,
It's understandable why we do that. We're trying to do the right thing. We're trying to make things completely risk free. But I think what we're looking to add into the conversation is it's not that one risk in isolation. Let's think about the risk of the passengers on the train. And I think, to be honest, that
yeah,
equation's got a little bit unbalanced. So we're just kind of bringing that balance back. But a lot of it is cultural because for 20, 30 years, we've been telling frontline staff, look, if you're in doubt, stop the train service. So we've
yeah,
got to give people the tools and importantly, the confidence to make those decisions going forward. And know that they've got, the industry's got their back and we've got the processes that support them in doing so. So yeah,
yeah,
all of those things, frankly, Neil. And I think on performance, on these big ticket items about looking at the train plans and looking at how to improve operational performance, a lot of that is cultural. And I think the industry traditionally has been very proud of fighting for incremental performance improvements. I think over recent years, for understandable reasons, we've perhaps become a little bit distracted. There's been so much going on. So a lot of this isn't particularly new stuff at all. This is just going back to saying, look, remember why we're here. We're here to run a safe railway. And every day we come to work, me and everyone else in the industry, we should be looking for these incremental improvements in performance. It's kind of almost reminding people that's kind of why we're here fundamentally.
yeah. Right. And I think we've got a little bit of time, so I do want to throw in an interesting question or a couple of questions that have come in the chat because we started out in terms of what performance means to what the railway can deliver for people
Yeah.
fundamentally. There's a couple of different angles on that. Firstly, there's a question about the trade-off between levels of performance and levels of demand, and
Yes.
the extent to which we might be prepared to accept a drop in performance if we're able to accommodate more services to do that.
Yeah.
What's your take on um, the extent to which that's an important trade-off we need to consider now
Mm,
for where
mm.
the railway is,
I-
and also
yeah.
how much we really know the relationship between demand and performance and how that plays out in practice day to
Yeah.
day.
Yeah. It's a great question. And it's a really central question actually, that on any of these subjects you quickly get into when you're deciding what actions you're gonna take. I
Yeah,
think I think we need to recalibrate the trade-off, I suppose, is the overall answer. So I think we've got to a point where we almost got to a point where there were no minimal standards for performance. There was no level at which you could not consider a trade-off. And I think actually the recalibration we need is saying no, the trade-offs can occur at the margins, and there are absolutely trade-offs between capacity, demand, and performance. But if you've got a train service, for example, that even on its very best day in any period can only get to around 70%, you've traded off to a level where actually you're well below what should be a minimum standard. Um,
mm,
and so it's kind of saying, look, there are some minimal thresholds which you will just not compromise. And again, I think government has given us the right direction on this. They've said, look, a really good railway looks like a railway that runs at 90% and has lower levels of cancellations. That to me is kind of the base level.
Yeah.
If you're at the the really sort of good position of being in the mid 90s and a great operator, Greater Anglia are a great example of this. It's a really real question to say, well, do you go chasing 96, 97%? And if that was at the expense of capacity improvements, absolutely, that's a real trade-off. But I think making trade-offs on a railway, for example, that might be at 70% and saying we think we can squeeze more capacity, and I think that's where we've gone a bit too far, if I'm honest. So trade-offs, absolutely, but I think at the right level. We are doing, on the second part of the question, we are doing some very interesting work on where we're going to make trade-offs on the train service. If we're looking to run slightly less trains in certain areas, and we may decide that's part of the equation, what would we actually lose in revenue potentially? But also, what will the revenue uplift be of higher performance? Because the move from today's 84-85% time to 3 level, which is where the industry is at, to the 90% we want to get to, there is a distinct revenue uplift we'll get from a higher performing railway, and that's being modelled at the moment. So it's a very interesting question, and we're going to come up with some answers on that.
Excellent. And there's part of that I think I'll take back to colleagues in steer who will be more expert in this, which is playing out in things like dwell times. Do we really, and the extent to which we keep to them, do we really understand and have usable data, and as you said, management information, Steve, on how day to day more people and better performance go together? Conscious we are getting close to the time we need to wrap up, but if I can keep you for just a bit longer, I have unashamedly focused on people and passengers in most of the conversation so far. We've had a question about freight, which of course will remain a private sector interest and important to the railway and investment in the railway. Is there anything different or extra, Steve, for you that you want to say about what performance means for freight and how we deliver for freight end users?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few things on this. So the freight element of the industry is doing some really good work on performance improvement themselves, which I'm closely plugged into. And also, we're very keen to get freight representation at MPB whenever we can. So we're staying closely linked up. Unsurprisingly, and back to practical experience of the railways I've run, many of which were over intense freight routes, whether it's the Elizabeth line or Overground and North London line. A better performing passenger railway is actually good news for freight railways. And a railway that consistently runs better as a system will mean that freight achieve their delivery of goods to customers that they want to. So that's the first thing. Possibly slipping slightly into anecdote, but one of the things I found in raising performance on London Overground, for example, one of the keys to unlocking that was actually to prioritize freight pathing, because one of the great things about freight trains is they tend not to stop. So once they get going, they want to get somewhere and let them go. As passenger trains, we've got lots of intermediate stops, of course. So I think just getting the right regulating policies can actually improve both freight and passenger. But the one certainty I've seen over my career is a better performing passenger railway is good news for freight as well. But there is some great work going on independently by the freight sector of the industry on performance.
Lovely, thank you, and thank you to those people who have popped questions in the chat, and it's nice that we've been able to kind of find time to fit them in. So we are about ready to wrap up then, Steve, but before we do go, if you had just one kind of final takeaway to get across in 30 seconds for our audience today, what would you want to say to them about performance and where we need to go as an industry?
I would say that we've got the best and most sensible targets I can remember from government. I think if we can get to those targets, I think we'll have a railway we can be very proud of, justifiably, because the UK is a really complex railway. So running at those levels, would be really good. And I think what would come on the back of it is some of the highest customer satisfaction of any European railway. So there's a big prize to be gone for here. And that's what's exciting about it all. And I should say, I think we've got all the answers in the industry already. We kind of know what to do. We've just got to get it done.
Brilliant. Steve, thank you again very much for your time and your insight this morning. Very, very much appreciated. And thank you to everybody who has joined in. All the best.
Thanks
and
for having
take
me,
care.
Neil. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.